In this second section, I will address the question of how did the experience of the First World War contribute to the rise of Italian fascism. Across the world, the First World War, or the Great War of 1914 to 1915, caused bloodshed on a scale that had never been seen before. It also brought a new form of warfare, modern warfare that was anonymous and mechanicized. In old-fashioned hand-to-hand combat, it was possible to maintain a sense of heroism and chivalry. But in the First World War, soldiers killed and were killed in great numbers without coming close to their enemies. This experience traumatized and brutalized a generation of young men. In Italy, the First World War was particularly divisive, in that parts of the Italian population were against it. Italy did not join the war when it broke out in 1914, but that year saw demonstrations across Italy that pitched those who were against the war, the interventionists, against those who were for the war, the neutralists. Italy eventually joined the war a year late on the 24th of May 1915. This represented a victory for the interventionists. But the interventionists won because they were noisy, not because they were the majority. In fact, the war lacked the support of the Italian parliament and of most of the Italian population. Interventionists tended to be nationalists who romanticized war and who wanted Italy to gain new territories. The neutralists included many pacifists and socialists. By the end of the conflict in 1918, Italy had lost over 600,000 soldiers in the fighting. The number of the killed meant that almost every family had lost someone. Many thought that this was too high a price to pay. Although Italy was on the winning side, the Italians lost much but gained little. The peace negotiations brought disappointment, in that Italy did not obtain all of the territories that it had been promised by the Treaty of London in 1915, although it did gain some new territories in the northeast, as you can see from the map. The disappointment of the peace agreement deepened the divisions between those who had wanted the war and those who had opposed it. Public opinion was divided, as some saw the war as a triumphant victory and others as a pointless slaughter. Resentment against the war was such that veterans, upon returning from the front, were spat at in the street. Basically, the First World War was a rupture in Italian history. Italy was a young country which had only existed for about 60 years. It was created in the late 19th century from a jigsaw of smaller states under Italian or foreign rule. The Italian struggle for independence in the 1800s culminated with the creation of United Italy in 1861. As a new state made up of regions with different identities and traditions, Italy was fragile and fragmentary. Many Italians did not feel Italian and lacked a sense of patriotism. But during the war, they had been conscripted to fight for a country which they felt little attachment to. Fascism originated in the cracks of the failing Italian state, cracks which had existed since the 19th century, but which widened as a result of the war. From this fracture of the First World War, fascism emerged. The fascist movement was founded at the end of the war on the 23rd of March 1919 with the name of Fascio di Combattimento. This literally meant a group of struggle, a group of combat. It suggests how, from the beginning, fascism had a military character. It attracted large numbers of disaffected veterans. Veterans who returned from the war to find that their sacrifices were not rewarded. They were not given the land that they had been promised during the conflict as a way to boost morale. Fascism also channeled members from pre-war political groups, such as the interventionists, the futurists, the nationalists, the groups who had pushed Italy into the war. The leader of the fascist movement was Benito Mussolini. Mussolini had been a revolutionary socialist until 1914, when he was expelled from the party because of his support for the war. Mussolini had been an interventionist. In later fascist propaganda, much was made of the fact that Mussolini fought in the war and sustained an injury. But in fact, he spent only a short spell at the front and had been wounded in training. The early years of fascism were defined by a violent opposition to socialism. The 2 years after the war, 1918 to 1920, were called the 2 red years. This is because of the strength of socialism in that period. These were years of economic crisis and growing unemployment. Socialist and other left-wing groups organised strikes, protest, and the occupation of land and factories. Support for socialism soared. In response, the fascists formed armed squads, or paramilitary groups, which carried out violent attacks against socialists and other working-class organisations. The fascists beat and killed socialists. They burnt socialist headquarters, and they forced their opponents to drink castor oil, which is a powerful laxative with a disgusting taste. The fascist armed squads were made up mainly of young men of the lower middle classes, many of whom were veterans, and as such used to violence and to handling guns, knives, and hand grenades. The government did not stop the fascists. This was because they saw the fascists as a way to avert the threat of a socialist revolution. Italy's democratic authorities hoped to use fascism against socialism, but in the end they succumbed to the fascist regime. The struggle between fascists and socialists was a fight between right and left. But beyond these wider differences, the two sides disagreed about the First World War. The fascists saw the war as a glorious triumph, but the socialists viewed the war as a pointless loss of life and a failure. When fascism was founded in 1919, it had quite a confused or hazy agenda, which included some socialist elements. But quickly, fascism moved to the right and defined itself in opposition to socialism. Within 2 years, between 1919 and 1920, fascism went from being a small militia group to a party with a wide support among the Italian population. Within this time, its supporters increased from a few thousand to the tens of thousands. And on the 28th of October 1922, the fascist party was able to march into Rome and seize power. The March on Rome in 1922 was essentially a symbolic gesture, or a theatrical act. About 50,000 fascists marched into Rome, while thousands seized power in smaller centres across Italy. Under the regime, the March on Rome was portrayed as a heroic revolution. In fact, it was reenacted year after year on its anniversary. But in reality, the march had been a disorderly parade of poorly armed men under the pouring rain. Italy was then a monarchy, but for reasons unknown, the king did not allow the army to fire upon the fascists and disperse them. Instead, the king lost his nerve and summoned Mussolini to Rome to take up the office of Prime Minister. Thus began for Italy 20 years of fascist rule. Once in power, the fascist authorities imposed their own interpretation of the First World War. They rewrote the history of the war as a glorious victory, a victory that fascism claimed as its own success. In reality, the war had been very damaging for Italy. It exposed Italy's weaknesses in terms of its military skills, its international standing, its foreign relations. But the fascist regime was concerned with restoring the nation's honour and dignity. It wanted to improve images Italy of itself, to make Italy look great, given that the country had been greatly shaken by the war. At this most basic level, fascism was an attempt to pave over the divisions created by the war and construct a strong national community. In short, Italian fascism was very much a product of the Great War. Many have said that without the war there would have been no dictatorship. Although fascism originated from political problems that dated from before the war, those problems were worsened by the conflict, and this created the conditions for the rise of fascism.